All right, friends, it's Friday. That means we made it through our first week of distance learning. Um, it's been a learning curve, but we're hanging in there. So I'm super proud of you guys for all of your participation this week. I want you to keep it up. I'm going to read chapters 6 and 7 of our read aloud today. There will be no assignment on Teams. Just promise me you'll listen. We'll talk about the book on Monday during our Teams meeting, okay? So chapter 6. Nate stayed very still in his hiding place. His empty stomach churned with worry. Panicked thoughts spun around his brain. Would he ever see Theo and Eliza again? What if Eliza had to do all of Nate's work now? How would she watch over Theo? The rocking of the ship calmed him some. He listened to the familiar sounds, the swoosh, crack of the sails, the creak of the wood, the twang of the sailors' voices. Bright pictures filled up his mind, memories of visiting New York City with Papa. Some of their voyages had started from there, and Papa always left a day or two for them to explore before they set sail. New York City wasn't as big as Philadelphia, but it had 25,000 people. 25,000! Okay, pause. Think about that for a minute. Most of us live in Navarre, and I think Navarre's population is around 35 to 40,000 people. And this is New York City we're talking about, so this is the 1700s. You have to think about how many less people were in New York City in the 1700s than there are now. Because we know for sure that New York City has way more people than we do here in Navarre. That was more people than Boston or Charleston. New York was dirty and smelly like every city Nate had ever visited. Garbage rotted in the alleys. Piles of horse dung steamed in the streets. But Papa always said New York was the prettiest city in the colonies. And Nate agreed. The wide streets were lined with tall elm trees. Gardens were bursting with sweet-smelling flowers that almost covered up the garbage stink. Nate loved the sidewalk puppet shows and jugglers who spun torches on the street corners. Papa would tip his cap at the ladies swishing by in their bright dresses. Best of all was the food. Suppers of juicy rabbit stew and gooey boiled puddings and buttery dumplings that slid down Nate's throat. Is this what New York City is known for anymore as far as food goes? One restaurant was so fancy, they actually gave Nate and Papa each a fork. A fork. Even most rich people like Storch ate with a knife and their fingers. But Nate and Papa figured out that strange new tool pretty quick. Nate's mind flashed with memories of Papa as the Valerie sailed down the twisting coastline of Connecticut and New York. He shut up his grumbling stomach by sneaking a few ears of corn. The sun was high in the sky when they came to Manhattan, the island of New York. Most of the long and skinny island was wild land, rolling green hills and forests, and marshes with just a few orchards and farms. It looked so quiet and peaceful. It was hard for Nate to imagine that busy New York City was just a few miles down, on the island's southern tip. But slowly the city came into view. Nate spotted crooked rooftops, the wharves jutting into the river, and too many church steeples to count. The Valerie sailed toward the bottom of the island and turned into one of the wharves. Nate didn't bother waiting until the Valerie was completely stopped. The moment it was close to the dock, he sprang up. With a few steps and a leap, he was off the boat. One of the Valerie's sailors swore in surprise as Nate streaked past him. But Nate was gone before anyone could stop him. He ran down the dock, zigzagging around the baskets and barrels and coils of ropes. There were only a few dock workers milling around and no big merchant ships. That was a little strange. Last time there were too many ships to count. The docks had been packed with sailors from all over the world, lugging crates and barrels and shouting out in languages he'd never heard before. But Nate wasn't worried. He'd probably come into a different wharf this time. It shouldn't be hard to find where the merchant ships were docked. A thrill rushed through him as he left the waterfront, his boots clicking against the city's familiar cobblestone streets. He'd made it! But as he plunged into the city, his excitement drained away. Why were some of the streets deserted? Why were some of the streets blocked off by big dirt walls? He saw no puppet shows, no ladies in swishing dresses, no fancy coaches clattering through the streets. Most of the stores were boarded up. On one block, the only people around were men. Soldiers, Nate realized. He could tell they were American soldiers by their plain clothes. British soldiers were famous for their brass-buttoned red coats. That's where the name Redcoat came from. They wore spiffy leather hats, bright white shirts, and belts with brass buckles. American soldiers had no uniforms. Most of them wore cheap felt, three-cornered hats and frontier shirts that tied at the collar. Those rebel soldiers looked like scarecrows, Storch had said. Looking around, Nate thought Storch wasn't far off. Most of the men wore dusty trousers and work shirts. Their weapons were beat-up muskets or rifles. The deeper into the city Nate walked, the more soldiers he saw. Most were hard at work. At the end of the street, dozens of men were building another big dirt wall. Farther down, Nate saw 3 men pulling a cart carrying a huge cannon. What was happening here? The hairs in the back of Nate's neck prickled up. Nate suddenly remembered what Storch and Marston had been talking about yesterday as they ate their goose. Nate hadn't been paying close attention. But now Storch's words came back to him, as though he were right next to Nate, barking in his ear. The king sent hundreds of ships. The big battle is coming any day. Washington and his army of traitors will soon be crushed. Nate figured Storch and Marston had been talking about Boston. As far as he knew, that's where most of the fighting had been. But now Nate realized they must have been talking about New York City. No wonder the docks had been mostly empty. No wonder the streets were deserted. There had to be thousands of soldiers here. Most of the people living here must have left, and that's when Nate fully understood what he'd done. He escaped from Storch, and he'd landed smack in the middle of the war. Chapter 7. 3:15 p.m. Nate charged back to the waterfront. His best hope was to catch the Valerie back to Connecticut. He'd figure out what to do when he got there. If he couldn't sneak onto the Valerie like last time, he'd beg the captain to take him. He'd offer to scrub the decks, carry out the dead rats, anything. But Nate was too late. He reached the dock just as the Valerie was sailing away. He tore down the dock, yelling, "Stop! Wait! Come back!" But the sailors couldn't hear him, and even if they could, Nate knew the captain wouldn't turn the ship around for some nobody kid. Now what would Nate do? He started out into the harbor as though the answer might be floating in the water, and that's when he spotted them, 2 enormous sailing ships. They were coming from the south and seemed to be headed right for the city. Nate's heart lifted up. Maybe he'd find a job after all. But as the ships came closer, he realized they were not regular sailing ships like Papa's. They were bigger. They rose proudly out of the water, each with 12 sparkling white sails gleaming in the sun. As they turned slightly, Nate saw that both ships had small square openings along the sides, and poking out of each square was the black muzzle of a cannon. They were like gigantic black serpents, peering out from their caves. Flags of England flapped from the ship's mast. They were British warships. Nate stared with a mix of fear and fascination, like the time he found a scorpion in his hammock. All his life he'd been hearing stories about the British Navy. It was the mightiest on earth, with hundreds of warships prowling the seas. The greatest British warship of them all were called men of war, floating cities that could hold 1,000 men and almost 100 big cannons. Each cannon could blast a 24-pound ball that would streak through the air faster than a person could blink. There was no weapon on earth as powerful as a big cannon. Nate knew it took 5 men to load and fire each one. One ball could punch through a stone fortress wall. It could rip through a line of soldiers. It could turn a house to rubble. It could blow a hole in an enemy warship, dooming it to an underwater grave. But the crew of a big warship didn't just fire off one cannonball at a time. They fired dozens of cannons at once, unleashing a crushing wave of metal balls. A man of war could destroy a city within hours. Nate's blood turned cold as he watched the 2 warships stream around the southern tip of the city. A crowd of American soldiers had joined Nate on the dock. They shouted out curses and shook their fists, and then a thundering explosion shook the ground. Kaboom! The explosion rattled Nate's bones and almost sent him leaping into the water in fear. But then he realized that the blast hadn't come from either of the British ships. Across the river in Brooklyn, big puffs of gray smoke rose up from a hilltop. When the curtain of smoke cleared, Nate could see 10 cannons lined up in a row. Kaboom! 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 They blasted away at the British ships, and then came blasts from somewhere closer. On this side of the river, the Americans must have put cannons all around the city. Soldiers were crowding the docks now. 2 men stood behind Nate. They screamed out insults to the British ships. "Putting on a little show for us, you devils?" one jeered. "We'll blast you up to the moon." The American cannons thundered and boomed. The air was filled with the sharp metal stink of gunpowder smoke. Soldiers whooped and cheered after every blast. Kaboom! Kaboom! None of the American cannonballs hit the ships. Each splashed down harmlessly in the river, but the soldiers didn't seem to care. They roared and taunted. "Sink those cowards!" But then Nate noticed that the bigger of the British warships had slowed down. A tongue of flame flicked out of one of its cannons. Kaboom! An odd sizzling sound filled the sky overhead. Someone screamed, and then crash! A cannonball came down, smashing a house just a few yards from where Nate stood. The ground shook. Shards of wood rained down. A man shouted out, "Run!" All right, that's the next 2 chapters. So I want you guys to be ready to discuss it on Monday in our class meeting on Teams. Have a great weekend.